Good evening, everyone. My name's Alicia Beal, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations here at Dominican University. And on behalf of the university and the Office of Alumni Relations, I'm pleased to welcome you to this special presentation by one of our distinguished alumni, Stephen Thomma, class of 1976. Last October, when I received an email from an alumna saying that Steve had been elected as president of the White House Correspondents Association. And as any good alumni director would do, I emailed him and said, congratulations. And the response I received back was a very gracious offer to come to campus and share his experiences and insights with our students. Well, I know a good thing when I see it, and I am now thrilled to have Steve here tonight to share his insights and experiences with you, and he was also here today and will be talking with our students also tomorrow. When considering the best way to introduce Steve tonight, I did what I often do, and I asked an alumna. I looked to one of our more recent alumni who also took a career path in journalism. Tracy Samantha Schmidt is a 2005 alumna who began her journalism career while a student here at Dominican, pursuing several internships, including one at Time magazine in Washington. After receiving her master's in journalism, she returned to Washington and to Time as a reporter. She then moved from traditional reporting to working with reporters, readers, and advertisers to harness the power of social media. She is currently the Director of Social Media Strategy at Cranes Communications, one of the largest privately owned business media companies with 30 leading business, trade, and consumer brands in North America, Europe, and Asia. We are proud to call her an alumna of Dominican University. Please welcome Tracy Samantha Schmidt.
Thank you, Alicia. Good evening, and thank you for coming. So in November, a headline on the New York Times website caught my eye, and it said that photographers protest White House restrictions. The story detailed how the White House Correspondents Association and 37 news organizations submitted a letter to the press secretary, Jay Carney, protesting what photographers said amounted to the establishment of the White House's own Soviet-style news service. The article quoted a man named Steve Thomma, the president of the White House Correspondents Association, who said, "They're excluding photographers from events at the White House, which is a problem in and of itself. But now they're sending in their photographers and video crews and then releasing the photos and videos. That sets up their own media operation." Having myself worked as a journalist in the Washington Press Corps, I immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Many of the events covered by the White House press pool are not particularly newsworthy. However, it is vital that journalists have access to these events so that they can objectively report on them. It is also imperative that the press have access to the president should a major news story develop elsewhere. Most famously, President George W. Bush's immediate reaction to the news that a second plane had hit the World Trade Center was made possible because the White House press pool was in the room covering a literacy event in a Florida classroom. The freedom of the press is essential to our democracy. It was a tenet that I learned here at Dominican University from that man right there, John Jenks. I'm a little off script, but I saw him sitting right there, so I had to give props where props are due. Where I studied journalism and political science from 2002 until 2005. Little did I know when reading that New York Times article in November that Steve had studied the same subjects that I had studied on this campus 30 years earlier. Luckily, I've stayed connected here at Dominican, and a few months ago, a good friend, Jessica McKinnon, who's probably somewhere, hopefully here, she called me and she said, "Tracy, I would love for you to do an interview with Steve for our alumni magazine and introduce him to people on campus for his guest lecture." I told her I would be thrilled to do so. What I didn't tell her was I would be so nervous. Because although I still work in the media, I now work alongside journalists. I help them understand how to use social media to find stories and sources and to report the news on platforms like Facebook and Twitter. It had been 5 years since I had reported a story. It's true. But Steve made it easy. When we talked on the phone in January, he spoke so fondly of his time here at Dominican, and many of his stories were similar to my own. Stories like working on the student newspaper, taking communication classes with Professor Calabrese, and learning how to write news articles from adjunct professors who were also working journalists. I found that he also shared my belief that journalists should have a solid foundation in the humanities. We both believe that to understand current events, a journalist should have a deep understanding of history, economics, and political science. Dominican had provided us both with that foundation. Finally, and most importantly, our professors instilled in us the values of caritas and veritas, or service and truth, which continue to guide our work in newsrooms today. Stephen is an exemplary journalist and an extraordinary leader in a time when the media faces great challenges and great threats. It is my great honor to introduce Steve to you tonight. Please join me in welcoming him home to Dominican University.
Well, first I want to thank Alicia, I would say for inviting me, but she kind of accepted my invitation to myself. She sent me a very kind note congratulating me when I was elected president of this White House press group, the White House Correspondents Association. I subtly and humbly suggested you might want to have me come to talk to the campus. And I want to thank Tracy particularly for that very kind introduction. Tracy said she was a little nervous introducing me. I have to tell you, the only time a journalist is truly nervous is when they are the subject of an interview. But she's doing a great job, and I've already seen a draft of her article, and I think she does it justice, probably a little too favorable to me and very kind. I want to thank my brother, Dr. Mark Thomma, in the audience. His wife, Mary, and my niece, Susanna, are here. They live right down the block in Oak Park and have kindly come to listen to some of these stories for about the 10th time. And President Donna Carroll and the faculty friends, John Jenks, whose class I met with and enjoyed their company so much this afternoon. I take great heart in the future of journalism when I meet those students. And Rick Calabrese, who remembers me and kindly, not every faculty member here would remember me quite as fondly or generously as Rick does, and I appreciate that. The last time I was on this stage, I was dressed as Mrs. Santa Claus. It was our senior skit in 1976. I was president of the Student Government Association, and the vice president, Nancy Sparts, if I recall, she played Santa Claus that year, and I played Mrs. Claus. I think there might have been some alcohol involved that night. I will say this evening, no costumes, but hopefully we'll have a few jokes, a few laughs, and have some fun talking about this subject that's very near to my heart. I talked to the journalism class this afternoon about my profession, journalism. You hear a lot of talk in the last few years that all journalists are biased, that we come to stories with preconceived notions, particularly about presidential politics and presidents, and we normally try not to share our personal opinions. I don't tell anyone except my wife who I vote for, but I thought you should know where I'm coming from a little bit more than my bio that you would read on our webpage. So I thought I'd tell you some of my personal biases about some of the politicians I cover. I'll start with Rahm Emanuel. You know him well. He's now the mayor of Chicago. I knew him in Washington as a member of the Congress and then as the chief of staff to President Obama. A few years ago on what they call Take Your Child to Work Day, I took two of my sons down to Capitol Hill, and Rahm Emanuel was having a press conference, and I took them to meet him, but I was a little nervous because I don't know how much you know about Rahm Emanuel. He is prone to, let's say, salty language. Rahm Emanuel uses the F word. He uses it a lot. He uses it in church. So introducing my then 8-year-old son Ryan to him, I was a little nervous. Rahm Emanuel was as nice as could be to my son. So that's my bias. I'm in favor of him for the rest of his career. It has nothing to do with policy. Hillary Clinton. A different day, a different son. I have three. Took a different son, Jack, to the U.S. Senate for Take Your Child to Work Day. About 6 of us reporters were showing our children around. No senator would stop. None would be bothered. In walks Senator then Hillary Clinton. She stops, particularly to talk to the young girls, but also to my son. Very gracious. Pictures, autographs, spent 15, 20 minutes talking to 4 or 5 children. The funny thing was, every other senator then stopped to talk to the children. They took the clue. And so I'll always have a warm spot for Hillary Clinton. Chris Christie, you might have heard of him, the governor of New Jersey. We all think he's going to run for president in 2 years, probably will be a major contender for the Republican nomination. He's caught in a scandal right now about a bridge closing in New Jersey. I don't have any opinions or biases about that or his ideology. Here's my bias. The day after he was accused of this scandal, he came out and talked to reporters, and he took questions, and he took questions for an hour. He took questions till no one had anything left to give. He took questions till the broadcast networks complained, when is he going to stop? But I got to tell you, for reporters, we love a politician who'll come out and take questions until we're too tired to come up with another one. So if he's president, that's a good thing. The last two, Joe Biden, the sitting vice president. A couple years ago, Joe Biden, who's a very touchy Irish Catholic politician and taller than me, was joking around, put me in a headlock, and he kept me in a headlock for a long time. I put him down in the negative column for that. I'll tell you the flip side, though. Every summer, Joe Biden has the White House press corps over to his house, the vice president's residence, for a very nice summer party. Every politician in Washington does this. They do a photo line, you come in, you take a picture, you move on. Joe Biden does that. Then he comes out and plays with the kids for 3 hours. Again, and I see most of these biases through the prism of my family. My son Ryan said, I want to go talk to the vice president. I said, well, go ahead. He's standing there in the tent next to the hamburgers. They talked for 10 minutes. I think he's always going to have a plus in my book. And finally, there's the guy in the White House now, Barack Obama. When he first came into office, when he was first running, I thought, this guy, this is fantastic. This is a fellow Chicagoan. Not only a fellow Chicagoan, he's a Bears fan. And he's a White Sox fan. I'm a White Sox fan. This is fantastic. So I was all prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt for the next 4 or 8 years. But then something else happened. I don't know if you've noticed it, the White Sox suck. I'm kind of thinking someone has to be held accountable, and I think it's Barack Obama. I'll tell you one other thing. When George W. Bush was president, the Bears went to the Super Bowl. The White Sox won the World Series. Nothing's happened since Barack Obama. I'm just saying. But these are some of the things I think about when I look at these politicians. A lot of it's personal and non-ideological, at least for me and most of my peers. I've been very lucky in my career. I've managed to cover a lot of politicians, a lot of candidates for the presidency, and a lot of presidents. It's something I love. I'm going to talk about some of them a little bit later. Mostly I'm going to talk about Barack Obama and his White House and his relation to the press. I'm going to start with talking about my personal experiences at presidential press conferences. It's the most high-profile event a president does. Often in prime time, in the East Room of the White House, very glamorous, the big crystal chandeliers. It's a high-pressure moment. For me, these press conferences are a story of apologies. There was the time the president, or president-elect, had to apologize to me on national television. There was the time I had to apologize to him and his staff, and in the process started a war with the city of Cleveland. And then there was the final time for which I make no apologies, and I played a small role in a turning point in the relationship between the president and the press. I'll start with the first one, November 2008. The president had just been elected. He was president-elect. I was here in Chicago for about a month to cover him as he started rolling out his transition team. And one day I had what's called the pool duty, and I'll explain that a little bit. The White House press corps cannot send 200 of us, reporters and cameras and wire services and radio text, every time with the president. We can't all fit in the motorcade. We can't all fit in the airplane. So we designate a small group, usually about 13 people, one newspaper reporter, one TV crew, et cetera, to stay close to him. And then we rotate, and then you report back to the rest, you know, what you see in the motorcade, what he says on the plane. And on this day in November 2008, he was about to have a press conference to unveil his economic team, his budget director, Secretary of Treasury. And so I had pool duty. We picked him up at his house in Hyde Park. And rolled down to the Chicago Hilton on the South Michigan Avenue, got in early. I was the first one in, and I noticed they had assigned seats in the ballroom where they're going to have this press conference with the president-elect, and they were labeled the Cubs and the White Sox section, and they were all assigned seats. And mine was in the Cubs section, McClatchy newspaper. Well, I wrote a pool report to the press corps that went out immediately by email. I said we'd arrived at the Hilton early, and I wrote, and I quote, "It's noteworthy that the press seats at this news conference have been divided into a White Sox section to the south and a Cubs section to the north. But in a crime against nature, your pooler, me, a genuine White Sox fan, a man who attended his first twilight doubleheader at the old Comiskey in 63, who sat behind third base for the 50th anniversary All-Star game in 83, who knew Bill Veeck and the wonders of Disco Demolition Night, who saw the great Ozzie Guillen play before he managed, has been assigned a seat in the Cubs section." This caused a bit of a stir. First, I got a call from a friend of mine at the Tribune. He said, "We want to do a story on that. This is very interesting." The Sun-Times called. The Chicago TV stations did stories. I even got a call from a cousin of mine who said, "I didn't know you were a White Sox fan." Well, it had an impact. And forgive me for a moment while I call up this slide. So the very next day, we're summoned back to the Chicago Hilton for his next press conference, President-elect Obama, and he's going to announce another team of cabinet members and nominations. And this time I showed up with the press corps, and I saw the seating assignment with a special note from his staff and said, "All's right with the world. Your seat is in the Sox section." Well, it wasn't quite over. The president-elect had to weigh in. The best part was, other than having the President-elect of the United States apologize to you on international television, was the White Sox called me that afternoon. The vice president of the team, very nice man. He said, "First, we'd be delighted to send you a jersey, hats, whatever you'd like. And secondly, since you obviously know him, could you get him to wear a newer White Sox hat? We're very embarrassed he keeps wearing this beat-up old hat." Well, I never got him to change his hat, but I have a new White Sox hat as a result. So now I want to spin forward. It's a year later, or the next summer. We're in the East Room of the White House. As I said, it's a spectacular setting for press conference, the biggest room in the White House, primetime television. Now, the president, a couple weeks before, had called on me at a press conference he was having at a summit in France. And normally, he wouldn't come back to someone like McClatchy too soon. It might be a year before he'd get back to us. But I had my questions ready. All of us have a reporter's notebook. And when you're going to a presidential press conference, you don't know if you're going to be called on. So you have to have 5 or 6 questions ready. And the reason you have 5 or 6 is the question you might ask first might have been asked. By the time he calls on you, CBS might have asked the same question. So you don't want to be standing up and looking like a knucklehead with nothing to say. Well, I've done that, but look like a knucklehead. So I'm sitting there, and I just happened to be in the front row. They had assigned seats in the front row. And the woman from the White House staff was kneeling right next to me with the microphone. They obviously have a list in advance. They know who he's going to call on because he actually has a list. And so when the president called on Steve, well, all right, I grabbed the mic, I stood up, I asked a multi-part question on health care. It was the hot debate of the year, the new health care law. I thought they were terrific questions. I asked 2 or 3 follows. I wouldn't let go. I was digging in. And the first hint I got that something was amiss was at the end of his answer to the third question when he said, and I quote, "I'm going to be visiting your home tomorrow to go to the Cleveland Clinic." Well, I'm not from Cleveland. I'm from Chicago. And something was amiss. Well, it took about a minute later. Lynn Sweet of the Chicago Sun-Times, a friend of mine, was standing up to ask a question. All of a sudden, Steve Koff of the Cleveland Plain Dealer stood up behind her, and you won't hear it, but to say, he took my question. This was the president's response.
Sweet. Oh. Well, I said Steve Koff, but he just stood up, huh? Well, that's not fair. Shame on you. All right, get in there real quick, Steve.
So I have that. Give me a moment while I scroll up here. And now I'm in the right place. I was mortified. I'm hard of hearing. I didn't hear him correctly. I didn't, of course, mean to steal the question of a colleague. I heard Steve. I heard Koff. It kind of sounded like Thomma. I didn't really hear him. Honest to God, there was no larceny in my heart. And I was very embarrassed. I wanted to shrink to about this big. I immediately made a beeline after the press conference up to the West Wing. Robert Gibbs, then press secretary, saw me walking up the aisle, and he was a good man. He just started laughing. I thought he was going to be mad. He started laughing the minute he saw me. And I told him, I said, Robert, you have to apologize to the president. You have to apologize to everyone. I did not mean to steal another reporter's question. I've had hearing loss, and I haven't gotten around to buying hearing aids. And then I said, but I think it's your fault. And he said, well, how do you mean that? And I said, if the new health care law covered hearing aids, I wouldn't be in this problem. Well, it wasn't quite over yet. As I walked out, there were a lot of my colleagues from the press corps wanted to do little stories on this little debacle. Thank you very much. I really wanted it to go away. In the meantime, I saw an email from my other brother, Greg, who lives in California. He'd been watching on television. Unbeknownst to me, the networks had an advanced list of who was going to be called on. I wish they'd have shared it with me. And when it got to me, it said on the screen, Steve Koff of the Cleveland newspaper. So my brother Greg calls and says, are you from Cleveland? So I made, I don't know if it was a mistake, but I told the Washington Post, and I quote, I don't know which is worse, being identified on national TV as an over-ego knucklehead or as someone from Cleveland. That did not go over well in Ohio. Cleveland is a little sensitive about its standing. I suppose I knew that. It started with the radio stations for about 3 days. It started, the newspapers did story, the television in Cleveland. They declared war on me. I've saved all the emails, because someday I'll put them in the book and just print them verbatim and figure that'll be my final vengeance on Cleveland, to quote their readers and listeners by name. I have since, however, taken Steve Koff to lunch many times. Deep apologies. I've done him some favors, I hope, through the White House Correspondents Association, but that was my moment of having to apologize to the president. So now we spin forward to May of 2010, another year, another presidential press conference, and there aren't that many. I'll talk about that in a bit. But the story of the year, that spring, was the big oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and I'd been writing a lot about it and asking a lot of questions inside the White House about it. And sure enough, the president gets about halfway through, and I hear him call my name. Now this time, I'm not taking any chances. I turned to my right to a friend, April Ryan, a reporter. I said, he really called on me this time, didn't he? She said, don't worry about it. He called on you. I'm not taking any chances. Meanwhile, Barack Obama's standing there waiting. I turned to my other colleague, Ann Compton of ABC. I said, he really called on me this time, didn't he? She said, not. Finally, I stand up. And I asked what I think was a very tough question about his handling of the oil spill, and got what we thought at the time was a significant answer, his first acknowledgement that they had mishandled this whole oil situation, when he said, quote, there was a lack of anticipating the worst case scenario. That's a problem. A day later, the Village Voice newspaper in New York wrote a nice analysis of the press conference and noted how it had been a turning point, that this was the first time the honeymoon had ended for Barack Obama with the press. This was tough question after tough question after tough question from the press corps, all on his handling of the oil spill. and they said McClatchy, quote, McClatchy gets the first resignation towards guilt from Obama in the room. Score for him. So I'll take that and offer no apologies. All this goes to the way of my personal and sometimes embarrassing or funny experience with asking questions of the president. The key to us in the White House press corps and to me is the ability to ask questions, to challenge the government, to challenge the president as the leader of the executive branch. The challenge we have now is they have built up this vast message machine around the modern presidency. And it makes it a challenge as never before. They build it to sell the president's agenda, yes, and that's always been what White House staffs have done, to try to convince the country or the Congress that his ideas are right. But now they're also doing it to sell the president or to do political damage control in ways his predecessors could only imagine and probably envy. By design or happenstance, what's happening is they're working to marginalize the role of the free press, the traditional press, push us away. Then at the same time, they're taking advantage of this rapidly changing media landscape, in essence, to create a government media, a White House media of their own, to tell their own version of the truth. Once, it wasn't that long ago, the relationship between the press and president was much less formal, not as confrontational, sometimes downright chummy. I have recently, in working on the history of the Correspondents Association, it's our centennial, discovered photos from the 1920s of reporters who would cheer a president at the end of his first press conference. Gives me a chill. I mean, I'm not sure I'd like to be in that picture today of clapping or applauding a president. Franklin Roosevelt, when he was president, had reporters into the Oval Office twice a week, sometimes 200 of them standing. It's not that big a room. And it was very cordial, chumming. The key difference is none of them could quote the president. That's a modern invention. So they got along a lot better if they weren't quoting him. They were simply writing stories generally about what the U.S. was doing. It wasn't until Eisenhower comes in 53, has the first televised press conference, and that was taped and shown later after the press secretary had edited it down to a few questions and answers that he chose, I think with good intention, to get down to the newsier ones. And it wasn't until Kennedy comes in 61 that they had live televised press conferences. And then things really start to change with Richard Nixon, 1969. First thing Richard Nixon does is he throws the press out of the West Wing. Up till then, we'd sat in the lobby. We would interview anyone who's coming and going to see the president, and that's how we found out. As much as we found out from the White House itself, we'd interview all the business people, the lobbyists, or the congressmen who were coming to see the president. He threw us out. There is, between the West Wing and the residence, a small area in which Franklin Roosevelt, in the 30s, built a swimming pool. He liked to swim. He had polio. It was the only outlet he had. John F. Kennedy used the swimming pool. Nixon decided to floor it over and throw the press in there. Not in the pool, but in that room. So he moved us farther away. Nixon also did something else. He created the Office of Communication. Up till then, there'd been a press secretary. That started with Roosevelt. It lasted for about 30 years. And the press secretary would have a few aides to make copies of press releases and go out and put them in the mailbox. They were on paper. But Nixon starts this Office of Communication to have a strategy of how to sell Richard Nixon. By the time of Bill Clinton, there's 47 people working in that in the White House alone. By George W. Bush, it jumps to 52. Barack Obama, it jumps a lot to 69 people. That's $4.3 million a year in salary, all devoted to people to selling Barack Obama. That's just in the White House. That doesn't count the press and communications people in the National Security Council who communicate to us about foreign policy. It doesn't count Vice President Biden's staff, communications staff. It doesn't count the support staff throughout the executive branch at the Department of Justice and Defense, who are all political appointees. Those people all have a weekly conference call directed by the White House to communicate what their strategy is, what their talking point is. It's no accident that at a White House daily news briefing, if we ask a tough question, sometimes the answer is going to be, I refer you to the Justice Department. Well, by the time we call the Justice Department, they've known 4 hours before that we were going to call, because this was all planned ahead. And most of the time, they won't respond to the question at all, or they'll pass us off. So they're working so hard to manage the media. At the same time, they're working very hard to limit the president's exposure in what can only be called the most unpredictable landscape. The most hostile environment is to be in a live press conference where he doesn't know who's going to ask the question, or he doesn't know what the questions are going to be. First, the very nature of press conferences has changed. Just in the last 30 or 40 years, they used to be more freewheeling. They used to have more questions. John F. Kennedy would sometimes take 50 questions in an hour because he gave sometimes one-word answers or 5-sentence answers. Barack Obama takes 10 questions in an hour, 1/5 as many, because his answers are long. His second answer often repeats everything from the first answer and adds 3 more paragraphs. They're very cautious. But the most important thing is he has fewer press conferences. These are just in the first 5 years, the count of full press conferences, and you can see Bill Clinton, who loved to have press conferences, had 154. George H.W. Bush, and that figure is just for 4 years, not 5. Prorated would be at the top, 143. George W. Bush, 124. Barack Obama, 99. Ronald Reagan, 33. I have to credit this work and the research comes from a colleague of mine, Martha Joint Kumar, who's a historian and scholar of the presidency at Towson State University in Maryland and works every day at the White House studying the relationship between the president and press. Now that's the formal press conferences. There's a second avenue, which Martha has termed, and I agree, is called the short question and answer period. These are times in the Oval Office when we're allowed in for a few minutes, in the Roosevelt room, in the cabinet room, or he's at an event where we're just allowed in for a few minutes, and reporters can yell out 1 or 2 questions. Now that's a very valuable tool to us because formal press conferences can be 8 or 10 weeks in between, or in the case of Barack Obama, 3 or 4 months. In the meantime, we could have decided not to bomb Syria. Russia could have invaded Crimea. The Congress could have repealed health care. We need to be able to ask the president 1 or 2 quick questions in these short sessions. But we haven't been let in the room. These are the same totals for these, what they call short question and answer, the ability to ask a question on the fly. As you can see, Bill Clinton took a lot of questions, 742. George W. Bush did it a lot, contrary to popular image. George H.W. Bush prorated again, I mean not prorated, over a shorter 1-term period. Ronald Reagan, at the very last, Barack Obama. So you combine the 2 times. These are the times they're open to questions from the press corps in the open. And Barack Obama is in dead last. This is not a man who likes to take questions from the press corps writ large. Some would argue this is not the transparency he promised. I'll leave that to others to judge. Now, one thing Barack Obama does is he likes interviews. He likes to give interviews. He likes certain venues more than others. He does a lot of interviews. As you can see, he leads his colleagues in interviews. I think that's a little misleading. Now, Jay Carney quotes that to me often in our negotiations, that the president is accessible because he does these interviews. The problem with that is, A, he's choosing one outlet, one interviewer. In his first year in office, for example, 20% of all his print interviews went to one newspaper, the New York Times. Everyone else was excluded. It's almost always, since in the last few years, local television outlets, not print. I have a bias about that. I work for print. But I think we all ought to be able to question the president. And it's often, this total includes non-news interviews, non-traditional outlets, ESPN, late-night comedy shows. Just last week he went on Zach Galifianakis' show, Between Two Ferns, to talk about his health care thing. They get a lot of viewership, but these are not exactly the same questions the White House press corps would ask. I submit, I think we'd be a little tougher. But if you do combine them, and we'll give them the benefit of the doubt, with all availabilities to the press, if you include those interviews, he's a distant second to Bill Clinton. While they're doing this, while they're pushing the media away, they are creating their own media. They're taking advantage of the explosion of social media that's happened just in the last few years. Take Twitter, for example, which, by the way, they didn't use in their first campaign. As long ago as 2008, the Obama campaign, which kind of invented the modern use of online tools for campaigning, didn't have Twitter, didn't use it. But now, they send out things on that they wouldn't send out even by email or press release or say in the briefing. They use it, it's often obviously a one-sided view. I'll give you some examples during this oil spill when they were under a lot of heat and the tide was turning in their press relation. They really wanted to get a point across. The president was in command. There had been an early storyline started to get hold out in the public that he wasn't as engaged in this oil spill. He didn't care as much. So they were putting out, here's one tweet. A busy day here, but the president has not taken his eyes off the BP spill. Another one, our comprehensive look inside the aggressive response, which linked to an 11,000-word report, which mentioned their around-the-clock response and 73 mentions of the president, all of them often linked to photographs. Now, we've had White House photos back since John F. Kennedy. We've had a full-time White House photographer as a political appointee since Gerald Ford. The difference now is they have social media. They can release those photos direct to the public via Flickr, via Twitter. There's been an explosion, and it's a stream of flattering, behind-the-scenes shot. And there's nothing wrong with them releasing their photos. As I said, they always have. The problem is they call that access. They think that's access to the public. But it shuts out, they're using it as an excuse to shut out photojournalists, to shut out still photographers, the TV cameras, who see things differently. I'll give you an example. Previous presidents, and I think all of our presidents play golf, it seems to be the presidential pastime, have allowed the press to at least photograph them or film them or tape them, teeing off or finishing their round, and they play a lot of golf. This president does not. He does not allow photos. He plays on military bases. He plays on private courses. Once on Martha's Vineyard on vacation a year or two ago, he was on a public course. He got word that because it was a public road, our cameras had gotten a spot where they could actually see him going from the 9th to the 10th hole. He skipped a couple holes. He wouldn't even walk by lest they see him on a golf course. Here's an example from the same vacation in Martha's Vineyard. Now, this is a White House photo of him on vacation. He's making a call to a foreign leader, and they released this. Now, they chose what to release. There is no picture. There's no shot of golf clubs in the background. There's no shot of his golf shoes. There's no one in a swimming suit. We had no photojournalist allowed in the room. Here's another example. A while back, the White House took a photo and released this, and they labeled it the president editing a speech. And it went viral. People were very favorable about this. They said they could read the text and that his handwriting showed that he was extremely literate and thoughtful, and his suggested improvements in the text were fantastic, and it was very fawning. It went all over the place. But I got to tell you, a long time ago, in my first job here in Chicago at a place called the City News Bureau, my first city editor, a man named Paul Zimbrakos, who lived in River Forest, he drilled home the idea that a reporter cannot and should never trust anyone, especially the government, but anyone. The saying at City News, which should be drilled into journalists everywhere, is, even if your mother says she loves you, check it out. And this picture, there was no independent journalist in the room. We'd have no idea if that's the president's hand. We just know the government told us it's his hand. We don't know if that was staged. We don't know if he really made those edits. That's a government press release. Now, the photographers who work for the White House are good photographers. Pete Souza is the main photographer. I used to work for the Chicago Tribune. He's a fine man, and I don't suspect him of anything. One of his colleagues is a former McClatchy photographer, Chuck Kennedy. They're good people, good photographers, but we have no reason to trust them. And I'll show you this example, which is, for us in the White House press corps, an important and an internal reminder. After Ronald Reagan was shot in 1981, he was in the hospital, and the United States and the world were concerned about his condition. And the White House storyline was that he's in command. This is not a life-threatening injury. Everything is fine. And they released this photo of him from the hospital, standing in his bathrobe in the hospital hall. What they did not show were the IV tubes. They were right next, the whole tubes were coming out, the bottom of his sleeve. They went to the whole stand, holding him right next to him. They cropped that out. Had a photojournalist been in the room, they might well have just moved the camera a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, and showed a little more of the story. It's an eternal reminder why I think, and we as the White House press think, it's not adequate to have a one-way street of just handing out Twitter feeds, video, photos, without us in the room. Speaking of videos, this White House has started its own video operation. They now produce a weekly program they release online called West Wing Week. They call it Your Guide to Everything That's Happening at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. They allow their video team behind the scenes to get flattering shots of the president, joking with foreign leaders, meeting with his staff, all things we're not allowed to see, and we don't know how true they are. An example was last summer in South Africa, the president and his family were visiting the jail cell of Nelson Mandela. We lobbied intensely to allow our cameras at a minimum, if not also our small press pool, into the jail cell. We were told it was a private family moment. We could not be allowed. We would disrupt it. We pointed out, George W. Bush let us in to take that picture. Bill Clinton let us in to take that, but they said absolutely not. Within an hour, they released their photo, White House photo, of the same event, family, private event, to the world. Next day, they released their video, which they'd been planning all along. The result of this, I think, the White House says this is all very necessary, that this is a changing world, that they cannot command the bully pulpit that Teddy Roosevelt commanded. They cannot get all 3 television networks to show his speeches, and even if they did, there are 497 other options. That they need to go to the alternate media on every front. Bill Daley, the former Chicago politician who was White House Chief of Staff, told me a couple of years ago he was reading a book called The Shallows, and it was driving their decision. It's a book about how the internet and online reading was rewiring our brains and how we view things and process information. And, they take that into account. Dan Pfeiffer, who's the communications guru in the White House, told me a fascinating comment. He said, we don't care if you make a mistake in one of your newspapers, the Miami Herald, for example. We don't care if you correct it. We'll go to the Huffington Post today, right now. We'll get our version of the truth out. It'll go viral and we'll be in the bloodstream right now. But to me, that's all a one-sided place where the press doesn't get to question the president or the executive branch. Also, ultimately, the White House shares some of the blame for this environment where they say they can't get attention. There's a question of whether they overexpose him. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a great communicator by any count, granted a different media landscape, and he's famous for the fireside chats. What very few people know is he only gave 30 of them his entire presidency. He never gave more than 4 a year. Often he gave just 1 in an entire year. People would urge him to do more, and he wrote, I wish I could carry out your thought of more frequent talking, but the one thing I dread is that my talks should be so frequent as to lose their effectiveness. I think we must avoid too much personal leadership. I think White Houses, particularly presidents, once they've been elected, are very infatuated with their own abilities to have won an election. They think they can turn the country every time they talk. So now, they're not talking through us because we have questions, but they're going to all these various forms of entertainment shows, social media, and increasingly diluting their own message in the process. As I said at the beginning, I've been lucky to cover a lot of presidents. I didn't cover him, but my first president I got to see was John F. Kennedy. I was talking at the White House a couple weeks ago with a colleague, actually about 5 of us. We're talking about the first president we ever saw. And I ventured that John F. Kennedy in Chicago going down the Northwest Expressway in the fall of '62. I had to look up the date later. I didn't remember the date. I remember going to my Uncle Frank's house. He lived right by the expressway, and we got to see him. And a colleague of mine, George Condon, said, well, I saw him the same day in Cleveland. And we put it together that President Kennedy had left Cleveland, come to Chicago, and then went home to handle the Cuban Missile Crisis, when we saw him on the same day. But my experience, hands-on, starts with Jimmy Carter. I first covered him in Chicago in 1976 while I was working for the City News Bureau. He had come out, he was campaigning. I covered a brief campaign appearance. I also got to cover Gerald Ford briefly on a campaign swing. It was my very first taste, and I never got over that. My first interview with Jimmy Carter was after the 2000 Florida election debacle. You might remember that, the hanging chads, the tied result in Florida. Jimmy Carter headed an election commission with Gerald Ford, and I was down in Atlanta and invited me in for an interview. And I got to tell you, in 20 minutes, I knew all that was good and all that was bad with Jimmy Carter. The good was he was brilliant. Here he was, long out of the presidency. He was a master of the details of not just voting behavior and norms in our country, but around the world. The bad, He still had a grudge against Tip O'Neill, who was Speaker 25 years before. He went in depth on how he had a vote reform when he was president in the 70s, and Tip O'Neill killed it because it would have hurt one congressman in Boston. The other thing is, in all candor, Jimmy Carter did not like the White House Correspondents Association. He didn't like it because we insisted on having a pool follow him when he left the White House. Now, this is Jimmy Carter. He wasn't up to something. He wanted to go to a park. But we always insisted, ever since Dallas in '63, of having a pool in the motorcade. So he was the last president not to come to our dinner, and I hold that against him. I should say he's the last. Ronald Reagan didn't come in '81, but he had an excuse. That was the year he was shot, and every president, including Reagan, has come since then. Ronald Reagan, my first trip with the White House press corps was with Ronald Reagan. I got to travel with the White House press with him to Arizona. Didn't spend much time seeing him on that trip. I guess that was also the first brush with the reality of the White House press. Even then, we didn't see as much of the president. My main exposure to him was, I was a Minnesota reporter in Washington. I got to cover the Minnesota Twins going to the White House to win the World Series. I wouldn't get to cover a Chicago team for about another 18 years. George H.W. Bush. My first interview with him was in a Minneapolis hotel room. I was working in Minnesota. I was very nervous. He was then vice president. I'd never interviewed anyone of his rank. And I have to tell you, he was the most charming man I ever met. I walked in, here I am, a young green reporter in the hinterlands. He put me at ease. He had a breakfast wheeled in, invited me to sit down, called Barbara. Bar, come out and meet this nice young man. They were kind. Years later in the White House, he invited what are called regional reporters. I was low on the pecking order then, in for lunch in the state dining room. A couple years after that, I was up doing duty at Kennebunkport. He had that great place on the water, Walker's Point, and I was filling in for our White House reporter. And it was the day he announced Clarence Thomas as his pick for the Supreme Court. And so we got to go out, and he did it on the lawn, and we were right standing next to him. And afterward, after the press conference and the cameras, they all stood around and stayed on the lawn and talked to us. That is just unfathomable today, that the president and his senior staff would stand around and just talk to reporters. He was a gracious man. Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton always was and always will be a great story for reporters. Starting from the onset in '93, he was the one who invited me to my first party at the White House, my wife and I, and it was a summer cookout. And the invitation said the dress is casual. I don't know about you, but you get a White House invitation in calligraphy, and it says the White House, and you open up and it says the dress is, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know, to me that would mean shorts and a t-shirt, but it was the White House. Well, we worked it out. Bill Clinton loved to talk. He was a great reporter, a great president for the press to cover, and he was great to travel with. Bill Clinton loved, when we went overseas, to see everything in a country. He loved to meet everyone. And because he did, we did. We were on one trip to Turkey where he had meetings in Istanbul, which by itself was worth seeing. But he wanted to see the ruins at Ephesus. So he flies to Ephesus. The press plane flies to Ephesus. We spent the day touring the ruins. It was fantastic. I never really knew what St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians meant until I was there, but I owe Bill Clinton for that. When we went to China with Bill Clinton, it was the first trip of a president since the Tiananmen Square massacre. He went for 12 days. By comparison, George W. Bush went for 2. We went to everything in China. We got to see everything. I have one other quick memorable story about Bill Clinton. In 1998, the summer of '98 was when he was caught in the impeachment drama, and after the grand jury had interviewed him, he had to go on national television and admit that he'd had a relationship with Monica Lewinsky. The next day, he and Hillary and Chelsea flew off to Martha's Vineyard for vacation, was already scheduled. I was on that trip. We were in a press filing center they'd set up in a school, which we always did for vacations, very informal. The press secretary would come over maybe once a day and just tell us what was happening. Very casual, shorts and t-shirt. And each of the first 3 days, Mike McCurry would come over and say, it's of the house, this is remembering, he's just also told his wife he'd had an affair. He said, it's very bad over there. It's very bad in that house. Well, on day 4, Mike McCurry walked in one day and he said, I have an announcement. The president will be here in 5 minutes. He'll have an announcement, and then we're flying back to Washington immediately. We have room on the plane for 5 of you. I was going to fly home the next day via LaGuardia and commercial and connect, so I said, I'm just as soon to go home on Air Force One. It was just a little G5, a Gulfstream jet, so it was just 5 of us in the plane, and he was sitting right forward of us and trying to call world leaders from the plane to tell them he was bombing Afghanistan and Sudan. It was the first effort to really get bin Laden. It didn't work, unfortunately. But I'll never forget, we landed, and McCurry came back and said he's going to have to recall. He was trying to call Tony Blair, the Prime Minister of Britain, and they had a bad connection. And I don't know about you, but everything I'd always heard about Air Force One is it has the best communications in the world, that they can reach anybody, particularly in a time of crisis or war. And I've always kept that in the back of my mind. And I asked McCurry a long time ago, or a long time later, and he said, that's the big plane. The 747 has all that. The little plane didn't have as good. Then we have George W. Bush. George W. Bush was different in person than he was on TV. Gracious, at ease, witty. My first interview with him was down in the Texas governor's mansion. It's an impressive room, about the size of this auditorium. It's very Texas-sized. And he had these floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, maybe 24 of them, filled with autographed baseballs. He put his feet up. We talked about baseballs, how he got them. He showed me his prized possession when he was a little boy in St. Louis, from Stan Musial to George E. Bush. His dad had taken him to a lot of ball games. He had about a third of them were from when his dad was president, and he would get teams to autograph balls, and about a third from when he owned the Texas Rangers. A little while later, he's running for president. I'm trying to get a campaign interview with him, my partner and I, and we hadn't got any luck. We've been lobbying for a week or two, and we were at a political event in Phoenix. Karl Rove, his guru, walked over to me, straight over to me, and I got to tell you, I'm not that big a deal in Washington. I don't get as noticed as I'd like sometimes, but Karl Rove walks over to me and says, you didn't tell me you own the Contra Costa Times. I looked at him, I said, nobody's ever heard of the Contra Costa Times. It was one of our smaller papers. But it was an audience he wanted to reach, and we had an interview that night in his hotel suite with George W. Bush. It went on for a long time. It was terrific. It told me something about George W. Bush and his team. They had a sense of the country and the audience and the people they wanted to talk to. Some of them only want to talk to the D.C.-New York nexus. Some of them want to talk to people in Chicago and Kansas City and Contra Costa County. He did. Last, of course, my friend Barack Obama. This is from last year's White House Correspondents' Dinner. He's been a little tougher for me to get to know. He doesn't let the press in as much. I've had 1 or 2 settings with him. He's had a few of us in for an off-the-record lunch. He's gracious. The First Lady is very gracious. When I've taken my sons and my wife individually to the White House Christmas party, she really engages about schoolwork, and he's nice, and they're gracious enough to come to this dinner that I'll have in about 6 weeks, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, even though we beat the heck out of them all year, so I'll give them points for that. Finally, just in closing, I'll point out they're going to all keep trying to get around us. We're only a couple of years away from the next president. Even if it's Chris Christie and he's inclined to come out and talk to the press for an hour at a time, the gravity of the place is to pull away from the press and pull away from exposure and pull away from criticism and questions. But I don't mean to be high and mighty, but the Founding Fathers put my job in the Constitution for a reason. And that's to keep asking questions, to keep the eyes of a free press on the president and the government. And we'll keep working at it, and we'll keep challenging them and testing them and prodding them. As the media changes or not, that principle will endure. And I'll say this, just as I expect him to take our questions, I'm happy to take your questions. If you don't mind, they have microphones set up, and I think they'd prefer it if you walk down to a microphone or not. If you don't have any questions, could you please go to the microphone?
I'm curious to know what your reaction is to or your thoughts on the president's press secretary. As I watch him sometimes on television, I get the sense that he's totally out of his element, and yet the guy's been doing the job for several years, and so he must be very effective. But sometimes you just kind of go, you're coming out to give us a message, And I sometimes wonder if he even agrees with the message that he has to give. So I'm just curious what your reaction is to him.
Well, Jay Carney is the current press secretary. I've known a lot of them. He's a former newspaper reporter. He started with my company, the Miami Herald, worked for Time magazine for a long time, won some of the major awards for the coverage of the presidency. Whether he's doing a good job or not, I mean, there are two judges of that. One is his boss, the president, and the other is us. It's long been said that the office of the press secretary is situated exactly halfway between the Oval Office and the press room, on purpose, because they really look both ways. They're explaining the press to the president and acting as an intermediary to explain to us. The president clearly thinks Jay Carney's doing a good job. He's been in the job for several years now. That's up to Barack Obama to decide. I've just shown, I'm not as favorable to the overall communication strategy of this White House. I'm not sure Jay Carney devised that strategy, but I don't think they're doing the president a great service. Was that as diplomatic as I could possibly make it? I mean, I've known other press, I'll say this also. In the White House press corps, we have two press secretaries we consider the models of the last half century. Marlin Fitzwater, who was Ronald Reagan's last press secretary and then stayed over to George H.W. Bush, and Mike McCurry. And both of them clearly saw the job as one of public service, that, sure, they were fans of their presidents, they were partisans, but they saw their job as answering the questions about the workings of government, not as political operatives. And they stand today, I think, as the two best in the last, since Kennedy. Yes, please.
You know, frequently when I listen to either the president speak or an executive branch member speak, I have to wait till I hear what the analysts say about what they said, because apparently they speak in formula. You know, maybe they're speaking to us, supposedly, but they're giving messages to leaders overseas or whatever. So I never really know if what I'm hearing is what's being said. I mean, you know, what's being communicated. Is that true? I mean, do you guys have some kind of book that you look up the formula? You know what I mean?
If there is, they haven't given it to me. No, there are occasions. If you're watching, like, for instance, a White House news briefing with the press secretary, and you hear him say, I can't address that from the podium, that's often a diplomatic situation. He'll talk on background, off the podium, but not on camera. There was a recent example, and this goes to the heart of my analysis. The Dalai Lama was at the White House to visit the president. And like past presidents, they choose not to meet the Dalai Lama in the Oval Office because they don't want to give him the recognition as a head of state and alienate China. It's a diplomatic dance. Now, past presidents have also allowed a press photo to be released. This White House has not allowed us in the room for some reason, and then they chose to release their own photo. But that's all part of a diplomatic message they're sending to China without sending a message to China. Sometimes I think they might outsmart themselves. But a lot of the time, also, I'm sorry, another one is they say, I'll take that question. If you hear that, that means he doesn't have an answer. And they'll get back to us later. But most of the time, he has a briefing book. I mean, you'll see him flip sometimes. If you ask an obscure question about a country that's not been in the news, he'll flip to the briefing book for the answer. I think one problem or challenge Jay Carney has now is, like his boss, I think he talks too much. I think his answer, he goes on too long. And that might reflect caution. It might reflect precision, but I think his answers go on and repeat themselves too much.
You answered another question that I had earlier when you were alluding to the fact that you never know if you're going to be called, and you have 5 or 6 questions, because sometimes during a press conference they'll be on one particular topic, and then some correspondent will stand up and ask something completely off the subject, probably because, you know, that wasn't the question he had prepared.
Well, I mean, everyone has a wild card question, too. One reason is in case he really has gone through every possible question you have on Russia, the economy, the Federal Reserve, and health care. I've heard people ask questions about, well, what do you think of this sports team? I mean, what delights you in the White House? And They seem off the wall. Funny is sometimes those are the questions that actually draw out a response that's the least scripted because it's least expected. Curiously, at the embarrassing moment of my entire life, the time I stood up and asked a question when I wasn't called on, the question Lynn Sweet went on to ask after the president said, "Shame on you," she asked about the recent altercation in Boston between a black college professor and a white policeman, and the president made a mistake. I mean, he took sides in a public, and presidents don't do that, and they had to walk that back for about 5 days. So sometimes the off-the-wall questions can be the best.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the question with the Obama administration, the over-control or over-management of the press. If you feel like that is a product of the media itself, in a sense that there is this never-ending election cycle, and so administrations have to constantly be aware that they're running for the next election, which I would say is a more modern phenomena in the media these days, and that maybe, I think all of us agree with you that the Obama administration isn't as transparent as they should be, but that this could be in the equation as well.
There's no doubt the media plays a role in this. First, television, and I mean, I speak as a print guy, so obviously I'm a little biased on that. The televising of briefings itself, which is about 20 years old, has made the actual questions have become part of the storyline now. How many questions did we ask about something? People actually write that the White House was deluged with questions. To me, it's always about what the ultimate answer is, but the media has become not only fractured, but partisan. You know, look in the cable news, I mean, you got Fox, which is clearly a conservative and pro-conservative network, and MSNBC is a clearly liberal network. CNN tries hard to play it down the middle, but you see where the ratings are. They're going to the other two. And that's self-reinforcing. And you know, the White House plays that to a certain degree. And that's filtering out into the whole media, not necessarily partisan, but our White House press corps has changed dramatically. I mean, it used to be, when I went to China with Bill Clinton, there were 20 newspapers on a trip. Next week in Europe, there'll be 5 when the president goes to Europe. But in its place, we have Politico, which is all online. We have BuzzFeed is now credentialed to cover the White House. Yahoo News has a reporter full-time at the White House. In fact, is a member, their reporter's a member of the board, the White House Correspondents Association. We have a lot of online media moving in now. And the White House thinks they're trying to navigate all that. I'm not sure they're successful, because in the end, all that is still what I call traditional media. It's still reporters asking questions who are going to write an article, as opposed to the White House view, which is we'll just tell our story and there will be no questions.
I just had a quick question about the watchdog role of the press. And in a lot of state houses, for example, the financial problems of newspapers and TV stations have really led to a cutback in reporters' staffing in state houses. And obviously the financial problems of the industry are going to continue maybe for a while. But what does this do to the watchdog function in Washington, do you think, the problems?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the budget cutbacks in state capitals, which is real, we own a lot of papers in state capitals. Those papers that are in state capitals do fine, but if you have to send someone down to a state capital, papers don't do it anymore. And on that front, an interesting thing, a lot of the fights that used to be waged in Washington, interest groups now, though, they're going to fight them state by state on questions of reproductive rights or abortion as being fought in state capitals, partly because the interest groups have a freer move. They can move more easily. They don't have much press. They don't have much scrutiny. They don't have watchdog groups who watch campaign money. It's a much less regulated, less scrutinized environment. In Washington, most newspapers have either closed their Washington bureaus. There's only 5 or 6 left of what used to be 30. And those who have them, very few have what we call regional reporters who are only watching their state or their delegation or their senators. Very few. McClatchy still has some, but most have gone away. And so members of Congress particularly have a much freer ride. I don't think that's good. Yeah, yeah. Anyone else?
First of all, thank you very much for coming to speak to us. And I was really interested in your time here as student government president. There are a couple of student government members here in the audience, and I was wondering if there were pieces of advice as we take on new initiatives in student government and initiatives that you personally took on as student government president when you were here.
Well, I had an interesting time with the Student Government Association. One is a little more frivolous, and I was talking to some of the professors earlier. I initiated what we called beer blasts in the grill, which isn't quite there anymore. There was a lot of alcohol in those beer blasts, so we did that, and I was very popular. On the more substantive front, I was president during an election year, and we managed to get a lot of candidates into the school here. A great regret I have is we didn't coordinate that enough. We had very small audiences. We had candidates for governor. We had Bill Arakis was the state superintendent of education, if memory serves. I think we had 6 people show up. That's a mistake. If you do that, if you engage public life, whether you're lobbying the legislature, which student governments should do because there are always issues at stake about college financing, I would work hard to start with the social media, start with your networking, get the backing of the school, engage more people than I did, because those are valuable things and need to be done.
I wanted to know what you see as a solution to the problem that you've been talking about, because I agree with you, but I think President Obama is very effective at like between two ferns and going on the talk shows and presenting his message to especially the youth are just, he's very good at getting out what he wants out. So if he's not allowing the press in as much, I think it's just going to get worse with each president because it's so much more easy to do it online or through the social media. How do you see a solution to get it back to truth in the press?
That's the $64,000 question. First, it's absolutely, every White House I've covered has been worse than the one before on this front. And there's no reason to think that it will ever just automatically reverse itself despite their campaign promises that I'll be the most transparent in history or whatever. Gravity will always pull them in the direction. I'm not sure I agree with the premise that he's been successful at getting his message out. He's got about a 40% approval rating. Now, the White House staff argues to me that this is a new world that George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and to some extent Bill Clinton, inhabited, where we're just so polarized in our country that no one can bridge that and get to a majority. I don't think that's true. I just don't think we've found the leader yet who, like a Teddy Roosevelt, a Franklin Roosevelt, a Ronald Reagan, is going to find a way to master both the right combination to these problems, but also this changing media landscape. These are all people who have not mastered it. They have not found the answer. Someone will. This country will coalesce. It'll come around a majority, and it just may take the right leader. I'm not sure I'm going to ever venture to guess who that will be. Now, whether they are going to do that in the process of not being particularly helpful to the White House press corps is a different story. I hope they will use both. But I don't think our politics is stuck where it is now.
Do you think the trends, I mean, it's kind of a modern trend, but we have such unrealistic, such higher expectations for our representatives. Not only is he a president, but he's also a celebrity. And I mean, obviously that's where we get confused because we receive these kind of shallow, like you said, very structured ideas of him. I mean, that they want us to get. Would you accept a more analytical perspective from a controlled press? I mean,
I'm not sure. I mean, I wouldn't accept a more analytical approach from the government.
Right, from
which is
anything
where
they would
they're
give
headed.
us would, right.
And believe me, one of the big concerns we have is the legacy that whoever the next president is, they're going to just build on this. They're going to say, well, we're going to do that plus more. I wouldn't accept that at all from the government. Whether there's another analytical approach inside our side of the media, which includes social media, yeah, I think we're doing that now.
Well, but isn't it, as you know, as young people in using the social media as a main news source, isn't it our responsibility, our fault to accept these, like, I mean, these shallow standards? I mean, shouldn't we be the solution?
Well, I mean, whether you accept it or not, I'm not a judge of that. I mean, the only way we measure that is election results. And we just had a presidential election where the President of the United States got sizable majorities of young voters, women voters, minority voters. However, I would venture to guess in this fall's midterm elections, none of those things will be true for his party. And I don't know what will happen in the 2016 election. So whether young people accept or reject that, some of that's the demographic trend toward the Democratic Party, but I don't think it signals an acceptance of that strategy by the White House or the government. And I think if we got into a real crisis like we were 5 years ago, everyone tunes in more and everyone demands more. Right now, the economy's not great, but the reality is the country's getting along. We're in relative peace. The president chooses not to, he's getting us out of 2 wars. He chooses not to get involved militarily in other places like Syria and likely in Crimea. But I think if we got to another crisis that affected young people, we'd see much more scrutiny of the government.
Thank you.
I know I've gone pretty long. If there's any, oh yeah, I've gone way over my time. If there's any more, I'll take them. Otherwise, I'll say thank you very much.